Hello and welcome to another HanDrinksSolo wine info video, where today we are focusing on Domaine de Dieux's 2016 vintage of their cellar-aged estate Sangiovese, released 6 years after it was harvested. In today's video, I want to achieve 3 things. First, we're going to discuss what the wine tastes like in the glass. Secondly, I'm going to give a little bit of history into how Sangiovese was established in the Hemel-en-Aarde Valley. Thirdly, I want to discuss the still quite enigmatic cultivar of Sangiovese, and not only how it presents itself in its homeland of Italy, but also how its flavor profile is rapidly shifting for a number of reasons. So when we give this guy a sniff, we get what, for my money, is one of South Africa's most faithful expressions of a classic Sangiovese. It smells not unlike what one might expect from a Rosso di Montalcino. I mean, the nose really is moody as all heck. There's these pronounced explosive notes of cedarwood and some vanilla, but also salty, savory game meat, dried sage, and even a lighter floral potpourri element. And then, of course, there are the fruit elements that include red currant, strawberry jam, as well as an amazing sort of cherry pie baked crust. And finally, there is one flavor note which can be divisive, and that is a very subtle note of sweet balsamic vinegar. Some folk would say that is volatile acidity, which is a fault, and others might just say it's an incredible additional element that adds beautiful complexity to what is already an enormously complex wine. When we take a sip, I mean, this wine is just packed with this exquisite dialogue between, on the one hand, sour red cherry and bright tart pomegranate notes set up against sweeter notes of strawberry and cherry candy and raspberry sherbet. And the balance is absolutely amazing. For every bit of the bright natural acidity, there is also some sweeter fruit leaning against it. And tying it all together is some really quite serious tannic grip. Now, these tannins are a classic feature of Sangiovese as a grape generally, and these are only enhanced further by this Hemel-en-Aarde expression. So while it is absolutely exquisite to drink now, 6 years after harvest, I think this is going to still sit solid for another 5 to 10 years at least. And at this point, you might want to pause and just ask the question, how does a cultivar that is indigenous to Tuscany end up on the southern tip of the African continent, especially in a region that has become known largely for Pinot Noir and Chardonnay? Well, if we want to go right back to the beginning of how Sangiovese reached South Africa, it was the KWV, who was essentially an extension of the South African government at the time, that brought Sangiovese clones in 1975. This in turn explains why by the mid-80s there were already Sangiovese vines as far-flung as Carlitsdorp in the Klein Karoo on the farm of Boerplaas. But this little straggly block of vines never amounted to much, and in fact died during the drought of 2016 to 2018. Perhaps more relevantly for today's discussion, in about 1990, unbeknownst to what the KWV had been doing over on the other side of the mountain, winemaking legend Peter van Leysen began the process of importing Sangiovese clones into the Hemel-en-Aarde region. As I say, he started the process in roughly 1990, but he had to wait 2 years for quarantine, and once that was completed, he then had to wait another 2 years before he could even get those vines into the ground. Once they were planted in 1984 in what is now Bouchard van Leysen Estate in Hemel-en-Aarde, they had to farm the vines for at least another 3 years before they got a crop. So in 1987, they got their first grapes, but they were learning on the fly. This was the first time these guys had ever vinified Sangiovese. And so it was really only in 2001, 10 to 12 years after the process had begun, that Bouchard van Leysen got their first component that was fit for human consumption. And that Sangiovese component went into a wine called the Bouchard van Leysen Hannibal Red Blend, which is now today an absolute cult classic amongst South African red wine collectors. Now, over time, the locus of this frenetic Sangiovese activity in fact shifted over to Stellenbosch, but it was very much kept alive in the Hemel-en-Aarde by estates like La Vierge, Bouchard van Leysen, and, relevant for today's discussion, Domaine de Dieux. Now, some of you may have been listening to my flavor notes earlier and asking, how on earth can he claim that this is a faithful rendition that references Tuscany when his tasting notes do not reference tomato soup or tomato vines or tomato tapenade? Because the kind of vine-ripened tomatoes kissed by the Tuscan sun is a fairly textbook descriptor for any Sangiovese coming out of Tuscany. But the trouble is, if it is indeed a trouble at all, is that the flavor profile of Sangiovese is shifting quite rapidly, even in Tuscany. And for once, it's not climate change that is to blame. Instead, it is the frenetic study and cataloging and propagation of very different Sangiovese clones that provide perhaps richer color, softer tannins, fuller mouthfeel. And the popularity of the clones that deliver these slightly more rounded flavor profiles are fast overtaking the more classic salty, vegetal, high acid, often high tannin, sour red cherry, tomato, tapenade, moody, leather, savory, Severus Snape examples. Put another way, Sangiovese is becoming less a sort of Tim Burton type show and being transformed through clonal development into far more of a Joel Schumacher type affair with loads of camp mass appeal. Now, the change in the flavor profile of Sangiovese coming out of Tuscany is so marked that recently a bunch of masters of wine and wine journalists and critics visiting Tuscany had assumed, wrongly, that winemakers had been blending components of Merlot perhaps into Sangioveses in order to create the color and mouthfeel changes that they were experiencing. Of course, that would be illegal in places like Montalcino. What had actually been happening was simply that instead of blending un-Sangiovese grapes into it, they'd been changing the very nature of Sangiovese through these new clones. This doesn't mean that you can't still get the classic, grippy, eye-watering acid, firm tannins, tomato and cherry flavor profile, especially from the classic DOCG regions. But what it does mean is that it's becoming increasingly hard to pinpoint a stereotype of Sangiovese. And of course, all these clones are only possible because of Sangiovese's inherent ability to shift its expression to match its climate. In fact, there's a fascinating study on the broad array of epigenetic expressions of Sangiovese. Or put another way, it's kind of like studying genetic twins where one of them grew up to be a professional origami artist, where the other one was separated at birth and raised on a commune of Bulgarian mercenaries. They would still be genetically identical, but no doubt expressed themselves to the world in two very different ways. And that's kind of what this epigenetic expression study is all about. Now, if you're watching this on YouTube and you want to go deeper and understand more about epigenetic expression, well, heck, me too. And that's exactly the sort of thing we do here at the HanDrinksSolo wine community. So why not subscribe to the YouTube channel where we release at least 6 videos each month, and then you get to watch all of my musings on unusual cultivars, wine history, wine science, and some of the exciting wines coming out of the dynamic South African winelands.